Hey everybody, and welcome back to another video from Northeast Christian Apologetics. My name's Simon Williams, and today you are watching our live stream that happens every Monday night at 6 p.m. We're going to be continuing our reading of The Reason for God by Timothy Keller. Here's Timothy Keller and his ministry called Gospel in Life. Highly recommend checking out his ministry, listening to his sermons. Dr. Keller has a lot of really good insights. Highly recommend checking him out. We are up to chapter 9 in The Reason for God. Remember, we are in part 2 of the book. Part 1 was Keller addressing certain objections to the reasonableness of Christianity and explaining why they're not sufficient for being a Christian or rejecting Christianity. And now we're in part 2, where he's providing us reasons that are sufficient for belief. Okay, he's looking to just provide reasons that are sufficient for belief. We're not trying to compel belief here. That's a standard that is unreasonable. Okay, we're just talking about situations and observations and evidences and that in which one can reasonably infer that a God exists or Christianity is true. Okay, you can get this book and follow along with me in the reading at christianbooks.com as well as Amazon. Highly recommend getting this book and putting it in your library so that you can reference it in the future and read it and also let people borrow it. It's a great book. Just as a reminder, we are going to be discussing the content of this book. I'm going to be pausing and elaborating on points as well as giving you my thoughts and things of that nature. And also, so if you would like to listen to the book being read without my struggling to read or without my insights or my perspective on things, then I recommend getting the Audible version of the book. You have to bear with me a little bit. My throat is a little scratchy today. I think that might come through in the audio. So just be patient with me as I read through the chapter. If you are a subscriber to the channel, I thank you very much. We still have the goal of getting to 150, which is a big goal for a channel like this, but I'm sure that eventually we're going to get there. And if you haven't already subscribed, think about subscribing, think about giving this video a thumbs up, stick around and have some conversations with me. Feel free to fill out the chat with questions or comments. Please remember to be civil. Please remember to be kind and patient, and we will get through this together. All right, and I am turning off the subscribe button this time. I finally remembered today. But yeah, I'm excited to talk about this chapter 9, the knowledge of God. Dr. Keller is going to be talking about how people generally have a understanding of God, a belief in God. The belief in God is both common and also natural in human beings. And whether or not it's natural because of how we're wired, evolutionarily speaking, or because we're created by God, is a matter of discussion, is a matter of debate. But nevertheless, it is still common for people to believe. Now remember that knowledge is different from belief. Knowledge is justified true belief. So you can have a belief in something and it still be wrong, and then you wouldn't have knowledge. So what Dr. Keller obviously is going to be claiming here is that people that believe in God have a true belief, and this book is helping them to gain more or further justifications. Okay, so that they can have justified true belief and have knowledge of it. But you can still have knowledge of God, a justified true belief, just by, and I've argued this in the past, just being of normal or having normal cognitive faculties and living in a world that contains this much coherence, uniformity, things of that nature, complexity, the specified complexity of this world. You are justified in believing in God. But if you go with Alvin Plantinga, you can also have a justified true belief in Christianity because it is a properly basic belief. And there's a lot of ways to go about doing this. But let's see what Dr. Keller has to say on this. So let's go ahead and jump over to chapter 9, the reading page. All right, so the knowledge of God. He starts off with a little dialogue for us. Charlie. Of course there's a God. We all basically know there is. Cynthia, I know no such thing. Charlie, of course you do. When you think to yourself, and most of our waking life is taken. When you think to yourself, and most of our waking life is taken up thinking to ourselves, you must have that feeling that your thoughts aren't entirely wasted. That in some sense they are being heard. I think it's this sensation of silently being listened to with a total comprehension that represents our innate belief in a supreme being and all-comprehending intelligence. What it shows is that some kind of belief is innate in all of us. At some point, most of us lose that, after which it can only be regained by a conscious act of faith. Cynthia, and you've experienced that? Charlie, no, I haven't. I hope to someday. All right, so that's from Metropolitan. So Keller jumps into the chapter with conservative writers and speakers are constantly complaining that the young people of our culture are relativistic and amoral. As a pastor in Manhattan, I have been neck deep in sophisticated 20-somethings for almost 2 decades, and I have not found this to be the case. The secular young adults I have known have a very finely honed sense of right and wrong. There are many things happening in the world that evoke their moral outrage. There is a problem with their moral outlook, however. Free-floating morality. In many cases, I have put on my philosophy professor hat in order to be a good pastor to people. A young couple once came to me for some spiritual direction. They didn't believe in much of anything, they said. How could they begin to figure out if there even was a God? I asked them to tell me about something they felt was really, really wrong. The woman immediately spoke out against practices that marginalize women. I said I agree with her fully, since I was a Christian who believed God made all human beings, but I was curious why she thought it was wrong. She responded, "Women are human beings and human beings have rights. It is wrong to trample on someone's rights." I asked her how she knew that. Puzzled, she said, "Everyone knows it is wrong to violate the rights of someone." I said, "Most people in the world don't know that. They don't have a Western view of human rights. Imagine if someone said to you, everyone knows that women are inferior. You'd say that's not an argument, it's just an assertion. And you'd be right. So let's start again. If there is no God, as you believe, and everyone has just evolved from animals, why would it be wrong to trample on someone's rights?" Her husband responded, "Yes, it is true, we are just bigger-brained animals, but I'd say animals have rights too. You shouldn't trample on their rights either." I asked whether he held animals guilty for violating the rights of other animals if the stronger ones ate the weaker ones. No, I couldn't do that. So he only held human beings guilty if they trampled on the weak. Yes. Why this double standard, I asked. Why did the couple insist that human beings had to be different from animals so that they were not allowed to act as was natural to the rest of the animal world? Why did the couple keep insisting that humans had this great, unique, individual dignity and worth? Why did they believe in human rights? I don't know, the woman said. I guess they are just there. That's all. Yeah, this is a very common view, this innate preference for the kind of values that have been established by Western culture. But you have to remember that Western culture has been sculpted over the past 2,000 years, and Christianity is a major contributor to that formation, that forming of the sculpture. And the values that we hold dear are very Christian values. These are the kind of values that are only readily apparent given a Christian worldview, like the rights of human beings, the rights of animals, the fact that women and men are equal, and should both be treated with dignity and are ontologically the same, even on the same level, ontologically on the same level, even if there are distinctions and differences. So there are many cultures out there that do not have that kind of idea. So you need to be aware of your own bias. You need to be aware of your own cultural context and why that cultural context came about. Western society is a very Christianized society. Okay. So Keller continues, the conversation was much more congenial than this very compressed account conveys. The young couple laughed at the weakness of some of their responses, which showed me that they were open to exploration and that encouraged me to be more pointed than I would ordinarily have been. However, this conversation reveals how our culture differs from all the others that have gone before. People still have strong moral convictions, but unlike people in other times and places, they don't have any visible basis for why they find some things to be evil and other things good. It's almost like their moral intuitions are free-floating in midair, far off the ground. And it's because they are, in a lot of cases, you know. You have to keep in mind that your moral intuitions are... We're going to be talking about morality here, and we're going to be talking about whether or not, I suspect that we're going to be talking about whether or not morality is relative, or if there's some objective basis for moral ethics, or if there are any objective moral features of the world. And intuitions play an important part, and if there are objective moral features of the world, our intuitions play an important part of recognizing those objective moral features, insofar as they coincide with them. But ever since, and from a Christian perspective, ever since the fall, we have been doing things that are right in our own eyes. We have been kind of forming beliefs and forming attitudes towards morality that are convenient for ourselves. Okay? Yes, it is true that God has instilled in us his moral structure of things, but we can fight against that via our free will, and we can form different beliefs. That's the whole thing about the Garden of Eden story, you know, like what was the fruit that they ate, you know, the knowledge of the good and evil. And so your moral intuitions are reliable insofar as they conform to God's character. The closer you conform to God's character, the better your moral intuitions are. Okay? And that requires work, that requires study, that requires prayer, things of that nature. It requires reading books like this. And so I commend you for coming out and being a part of this study. All right, so Keller continues. Polish poet Czesław Miłosz spoke of this. What has been surprising in the post-Cold War period are those beautiful and deeply moving words pronounced with veneration in places like Prague and Warsaw, words which pertain to the old repertory of the rights of man and the dignity of the person. I wonder at this phenomenon because maybe underneath this is an abyss. After all, those ideas had their foundation in religion, and I am not over-optimistic about the survival of religion in a scientific, technological civilization. Notions that seem buried forever have suddenly been resurrected, but how long can they stay afloat if the bottom is taken out? I don't believe Miłosz is right. I think that people will definitely go on holding to their beliefs in human dignity even when conscious belief in God is gone. Why is this the case? I have a radical thesis. I think people in our culture know unavoidably that there is a God, but they are repressing what they know. The concept of moral obligation. It is common to hear people say, no one should impose their moral views on others because everyone has a right to find truth inside him or herself. This belief leaves the speaker open to a series of very uncomfortable questions. Aren't there people in the world who are doing things you believe are wrong, things that they should stop doing no matter what they personally believe about the correctness of their behavior? If you do, and everyone does, doesn't that mean you do believe that there is some kind of moral standard that people should abide by regardless of their individual convictions? This raises a question. Why is it impossible in practice for everyone to be a consistent moral relativist even when they claim that they are? The answer is that we all have a pervasive, powerful, and unavoidable belief not only in moral values, but also in moral obligation. All right, so let me highlight this real quick. Okay, there is a distinction, and this is why I think that Dr. Keller is getting at. All right, not only in moral values are different from moral obligations. Okay, moral values deal with the worth of something. It deals with things like love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. These kinds of values, these are values that are goods, or there's also moral evils like hate, malice, lust, sloth, things like that. These moral values are different than moral obligations. Moral obligations deal with like commands, what you ought to do, things that you should do in any given situation. Okay. And a lot of people think that moral obligation is born out of the commands of God. And so those people are called divine command theorists. And I think that Keller is one, but I'm not entirely sure. But I suspect that's where he's going with this, that our moral obligations are not come about by commands. Like when you are a citizen of the United States and you get a driver's license, you are under a moral obligation to drive on the right side of the road. Okay, even though it's not an objectively moral feature of the world to drive on the right side of the road, but for safety considerations and by the command of your country that you reside in, you're under a moral obligation to drive on the right side of the road. Okay, but God, he provides commands, and this is supposed to be in a more objective state. Okay, I personally am not a divine command theorist. I think in terms of natural ethics, but that's another story or another discussion for another day. So let's go ahead and continue on with what Keller says. Sociologist Christian Smith puts it like this: moral is an orientation towards understanding about what is right and wrong, just and unjust, that are not established by our own actual desires or preferences, but instead are believed to exist apart from them, providing standards by which our desires and preferences can themselves be judged. All human beings have moral feelings. We call it a conscience. When considering doing something that we feel would be wrong, we tend to refrain. Our moral sense does not stop there, however. We also believe that there are standards that exist apart from us by which we evaluate moral feelings. Moral obligation is a belief that some things ought to be done regardless of how a person feels about them within herself, regardless of what the rest of her community and culture says, and regardless of whether it is in her self-interest or not. The young couple had no doubts that people in other cultures should honor women's rights, for example. Though we have been taught that all moral values are relative to individuals and cultures, we can't live like that. In actual practice, we inevitably treat some principles as absolute standards, by which we judge the behavior of those who don't share our values. What gives us the right to do that if all moral beliefs are relative? Nothing gives us the right. Yet, we can't stop it. People who laugh at the claim that there is a transcendent moral order do not think that racial genocide is just, impractical, or self-defeating, but that it is wrong. The Nazis who exterminated Jews may have claimed that they didn't feel it was immoral at all. We don't care. We don't care if they sincerely felt they were doing a service to humanity. They ought not to have done it. We do not only have moral feelings, but we also have an ineradicable belief that moral standards exist outside of us, by which our internal moral feelings are evaluated. Why? Why do we think those moral standards exist? The evolutionary theory of moral obligation. All right, so real quick, I'm going to make some notes here. All right, so we're going to be contrasting theistic models of theistic moral models against non-theistic moral models. All right. Now, you can, within non-theistic moral models, you can craft models that have moral values being like abstract objects that supervene on certain events and things, in order to have like moral obligation. Like certain events can have like the rightness associated with it if you are like helping somebody who has fallen on the ground. Like you helping someone has the property of rightness supervene on it. But these non-theistic moral models fail in a significant way in the form of like they don't have as much, they don't provide a framework that provides moral justification, or what I mean to say is moral, what is the word I'm looking for right now? Moral motivation. You don't have as much motivation to do the obligations that are from these abstract objects because they don't have any consequences to them. All right. So God, on the other hand, provides consequences. He provides incentive. All right. And also, like on non-theistic models in which there's no afterlife and there's no being to promote justice or punishment and things of that nature, it's less strong. So there's no reason to prefer it. You would have to demonstrate first that God doesn't exist in order to provide that as a viable option. Okay, so, but let's go ahead and continue with what Keller's saying. A common answer today comes from what I call in the last chapter the clue killer. Sociobiology or evolutionary psychology. This view holds that altruistic people, those who act unselfishly and cooperatively, survived in greater numbers than those who were selfish and cruel. Therefore, altruistic genes were passed down to us, and now the great majority of us feel that unselfish behavior is right. There are, however, many flaws in this theory, and it has been given some devastating critiques. An individual's self-sacrificing altruistic behavior towards his or her blood kin might result in a greater survival rate for the individual's family or extended clan, and therefore result in a greater number of descendants with that person's genetic material. For evolutionary purpose, however, the opposite response, hostility to all people outside of one's group, should be just as widely considered moral and right behavior. Especially since we observe this to be the case. Most tribes have a strong preference for their own tribe and do not openly welcome just any human. That is not something that's commonly seen. All right. Yet today, we believe that sacrificing time, money, emotion, and even life, especially for someone not of your kind, or tribe, is right. If we see a total stranger fall in the river, we jump in after him or feel guilty for not doing so. In fact, most people will feel the obligation to do so even if the person is in the water is an enemy. How could that trait have come down by a process of natural selection? Such people would have been less likely to survive and pass on their genes. On the basis of strict evolutionary naturalism, the belief that everything about us is here because of a process of natural selection, that kind of altruism should have died out of the human race long ago. Instead, it is stronger than ever. Other arguments to demonstrate the reproductive benefits of altruism have also run into trouble. Some contend that altruistic behavior brings many indirect reciprocal benefits to the practitioner from others. But this can't account for our motivation to practice such acts when no one knows about them. Others have contended that sacrificial behavior benefits an entire group or society, enabling the entire society to pass on its genetic code. However, there is consensus that natural selection does not work on whole populations. Evolution, therefore, cannot account for the origin of our moral feelings, let alone for the fact that we all believe there are external moral standards by which moral feelings are evaluated. The problem of moral obligation. This sense of moral obligation creates a problem for those with a secular understanding of the world. Carolyn Fleur-Loban is an anthropologist whose professional field is dominated by what she calls cultural relativism, a view that all moral beliefs are culturally created. That is, we believe them because we are part of a community that gives them a plausibility, and that there is no basis for objectively judging one's culture's morality to be better than another. Yet she was appalled by practices and societies she was studying that oppressed women. She decided that she could promote women's interests in the societies wherever she worked as an anthropologist. This immediately created a conundrum for her. She knew that her belief in women's equality was rooted in a socially located Northern European 18th century individualistic mode of thought. What right does she have to promote her views over those of the non-Western societies where she worked? Her response: anthropologists continue to express strong support for cultural relativism. One of the most contentious issues arises from the fundamental question: what authority do we Westerners have to impose our own concept of universal rights on the rest of humanity? But the cultural relativist argument is often used by repressive governments to deflect international criticism of their abuse of their citizens. I believe that we should not let the concept of relativism stop us from using national and international forums to examine ways to protect the lives and dignity of people in every culture. When there is a choice between defending human rights and defending cultural relativism, anthropologists should choose to protect and promote human rights. We cannot just be bystanders. The author poses a difficult question. If all cultures are relative, then so is the idea of universal human rights. So how can I decide to impose my values on this culture? But she doesn't answer her own question. She has just said that her charge of oppression is based on a Western concept of individual freedom, but she has no answer for this conundrum. She simply declares that women are being oppressed, and she feels she has to stop it. We have to bring our Western values to these other nations. Our values are better than theirs, period. The difficult issue of human rights. Fleur Lobin is struggling with a major crisis in the field of human rights. Jürgen Habermas has written that despite their European origins, human rights in Asia, Africa, and South America now constitute the only language in which the opponents and victims of murderous regimes and civil wars can raise their voices against violence, repression, and persecution. This reveals the enormous importance of the morality of human rights, which Michael Perry defines as the twofold conviction that every human being has inherent dignity and that it is obligatory that we order our lives in accordance with this fact. It is wrong to violate the equal dignity of other human beings, but why should we believe that? On what does this dignity depend? In his essay, Where Do Rights Come From?, Harvard law professor Alan Dershowitz lays out the possibilities. Some say human rights come from God, but if we were all created in God's image, then every human being would be sacred and inviolable. Dershowitz rejects this as an answer since so many millions of people are agnostic. What? Others say others say human rights come from nature, or what has been called natural law. All right, so I don't understand why this would reject. Why would you reject it just because millions of people are agnostic? That doesn't make any sense, because like the grounding of the rights themselves are in God's creating people in image. It's not in the people's beliefs of being made in God's image. So this is a weird reason to reject this hypothesis. But anyway, natural law. They argue that nature and human nature, if it is examined, will reveal that some kinds of behavior are fitting with the way things are and are right. However, Dershowitz points out that nature thrives on violence and predation, on the survival of the fittest. There is no way to derive the concept of the dignity of every individual from the way things really work in nature. Yeah, that is one of the difficulties with this, But if you combine natural law with Christianity, this idea that God created the world to behave in a certain way prior to the fall, then you can actually analyze what would be the natural order of things and thereby obtain an idea of what would constitute like moral obligations. All right, but let's continue. Now, another theory claims that human rights are created by us, the people who write the laws. Many argue that it is in the interest of society to create human rights because honoring individual dignity means that in the long run, everyone in the community is better off. However, what if a majority decides it is not in their interest to grant human rights? If rights are nothing but a majority creation, then there is nothing to appeal to when they are legislated out of existence. Dershowitz quoted Ronald Roken, argues that this third view of human rights is inadequate. It is no answer to say that if individuals have these rights, then the community is better off in the long run, because when we say someone has a right to speak his mind freely, we mean he is entitled to do so, even if this would not be in the general interest. All right. If human rights are created by majorities, of what use are they? Their value lies in what they can be used to insist that majorities honor the dignity of minorities and individuals despite their concept of their greater good. Yes, that's the thing about rights. And that's what laws should be geared towards. Laws, and this is a Western notion, but I think that laws ought to be geared towards increasing the amount of freedom by everyone. Okay, but in order to increase the amount to level out the freedom, you have to limit the power of the powerful. You have to legislate against the power of people who would use their power to oppress other people. That's the point of laws. It's to promote safety, to promote efficient living and well living, but also to promote the maximum amount of freedom for people by limiting the power of those who would misuse their power. Okay, but but why? Why should because the people that are writing the laws are also usually powerful. Why should the powerful limit their own power? Why should they do that? There's modes, there's metaphysical models that would be you'd be well within your reasoning to say, I'm in this position of power for a reason. The gods have chosen me, and that means that they've chosen me for a reason. I must be better in some way. I deserve this kind of power, and you ought to obey me. You ought to work for me. You ought to serve me. That kind of stuff, that is extremely common throughout human history. All right, so Keller continues. Rights cannot be created; they must be discovered, or they are of no value. As Dworkin concludes, if we want to defend individual rights, we must try to discover something beyond utility that argues for these rights. What could that something be? Neither Dworkin or Dershowitz can really give an answer. Dworkin ends up appealing to a form of majority rule anyway. In Life's Dominion, an argument about abortion, euthanasia, and individual freedom, he writes, the life of a single human organism commands respect and protection because of our wonder at the process that produce new lives from old ones. The nerve of the sacred lies in the value we attach to a process or enterprise or project rather than its results considered independently from how they were produced. That is weird. The process, just because we have awe of the process, we do have awe of the process, but is that really sufficient? There's many people that don't find this process to be sacred at all. They think it to be cruel and to be done away with. Lots of people nowadays think that way. That's weird. Law professor Michael Perry responds, the non-religious source of normativity for Dworkin is the great value we attach to every human being understood as a creative masterpiece. It is our wonder at the processes that produce new lives from old ones, but to whom is Dworkin referring with his we and our? Did the Nazis value the Jews intrinsically? The conspicuous problem with Dworkin's secular argument for rights is that Dworkin assumes a consensus among human agents that does not exist and never has existed. Perry's new book, Toward a Theory of Human Rights, is very significant. Perry concludes that though it is clear there is a religious ground for the morality of human rights, it is far from clear that there is a non-religious ground, a secular ground, for human rights. Perry lays out Nietzsche's well-known insistence that God is dead, that if God is dead, any and all morality of love and human rights is baseless. If there is no God, argues Nietzsche, Sartre, and others, there can be no good reason to be kind, to be loving, or to work for peace. Perry quotes Philippa Foot, who says that secular thinkers accepted the idea that there is no God and no given meaning to human life, but have not really joined battle with Nietzsche about morality. But by and large, we have just gone on taking moral judgments for granted as if nothing had happened. Why do we keep on doing this? The grand Sez Who The reason is laid out in a classic essay by late Yale law professor Arthur Leff. Most people feel that human rights are not created by us, but are found by us, and they are there and must be honored by majorities, whether they like them or not. But Leff says, when would it be impermissible to make the formal intellectual equivalent of what is known in barrooms and schoolyards as the grand Sez Who? In the absence of God, each ethical and legal system will be differentiated by the answer it chooses to give to one key question. Who among us ought to be able to declare law that ought to be obeyed? Stated that baldly, the question is so intellectually unsettling that one should expect to find a noticeable number of legal and ethical thinkers trying to come to grips with it. Either God exists or he does not. But if he does not, nothing and no one else can take his place. So true. You know, that's the thing. Like any moral theory that includes God has the grand Sez Who. Our moral obligations are created by a being that has all authority, and this God-like being, especially the Christian God, has if authority is something that is obtained through like a lot of different means, whether it be through strength, persuasion, actions, wisdom, intellect, majority rule, that kind of stuff, then God is in a state of authority to give to give commands. All right. All right. So Keller continues that if there is no God, then there is no way to say any one action is moral and another immoral, but only I like this. If that is the case, who gets the right to put their subjective, arbitrary moral feelings into law? You may say the majority has the right to make the law, but do you mean that then the majority has the right to vote to exterminate a minority? If you say no, that is wrong, then you are back to square one. Who says that the majority has a moral obligation not to kill the minority? Why should your moral convictions be obligatory for those in opposition? Why should your view prevail over the will of the majority? The fact is, says Leff, if there is no God, then all moral statements are arbitrary. All moral valuations are subjective and internal, and there can be no external moral standards by which a person's feelings and values are judged. Yet Leff ends this intellectual essay with in a most shocking way. As things are now, everything is up for grabs. Nevertheless, napalming babies is bad. Starving the poor is wicked. Buying and selling each other is depraved. There is such a thing as evil. Altogether now, says who? God help us. Nietzsche, of course, understood this. The masses blink and say, we are all equal. Man is but man. Before God, we are all equal. Before God. But now this God has died. Raymond Gaeta, a atheist thinker, reluctantly writes, only someone who is religious can speak seriously of the sacred. We may say that all human beings are inestimably precious, that they are ends in themselves, that they are owed unconditional respect, that they possess inalienable rights, and, of course, that they possess inalienable dignity. In my judgment, these are ways of trying to say what we feel a need to say when we are estranged from the conceptual resources, i.e. God. We need to say it. Not one of these statements about human beings has the power of the religious way of speaking, that we are sacred because God loves us, his children. All right. I think that requires a highlight. All right. And this reaction?
Well said.
Well said. All right. So that's what I was saying from the beginning. Okay. That's along the lines of what I was saying from the beginning. All right. So God is a feature of moral models that provides moral incentive, provides moral motivation, provides moral consequences, provides moral justice, ultimate justice, that kind of stuff. Provides a lot. Without this God feature, then the whole moral structure falls apart. You know, God is the foundation of moral structures, and provides structure and stability. Without him, morality, it becomes very flaky. It becomes a lot of craziness, you know? So Keller continues, Leff is not simply concluding that there is no basis for human rights without God. He is also pointing out, as are Dershowitz and Dworkin in their own way, that despite the fact that we can't justify or ground human rights in a world without God, we still know they exist. Leff is not just speaking generically, but personally. Without God, we can't justify moral obligation. And yet, he can't know, or correction, he can't not know it exists. The argument for God from the violence of nature. Why would we know this? To sharpen our focus on the significance of this indelible knowledge of moral obligation, consider the observations of writer Annie Dillard. Dillard lived for a year by a creek in the mountains of Virginia, expecting to be inspired and refreshed by closeness to nature. Instead, she came to realize that nature was completely ruled by one central principle: violence by the strong against the weak. There is not a person in the world that behaves as badly as praying mantises. But wait, you say, there is no right or wrong in nature. Right and wrong is a human concept. Precisely. We are moral creatures in an amoral world, or consider the alternative. It is only human feelings that is freakishly amiss. All right, then, it is our emotions that are amiss. We are freaks. The world is fine, and let us all go have lobotomies to restore us to a natural state. We can leave lobotomized to go back to the creek and live on its banks as untroubled as any muskrat or reed. You first. Annie Dillard saw that all of nature is based on violence, yet we inescapably believe it is wrong for stronger human individuals or groups to kill weaker ones. If violence is totally natural, why would it be wrong for strong humans to trample weak ones? There is no basis for moral obligation unless we argue that nature is in some part unnatural. We can't know that nature is broken in some way unless there is some supernatural standard of normalcy apart from nature by which we can judge right and wrong. That means there would have to be heaven or God or some kind of divine order outside of nature in order to make that judgment. There is only one way out of this conundrum. We can pick up the biblical account of things and see if it explains our moral sense any better than a secular view. If the world is made by a God of peace, justice, and love, then that is why we know that violence, oppression, and hate are wrong. If the world is fallen, broken, and needs to be redeemed, that explains the violence and disorder we see. If you believe human rights are a reality, then it makes much more sense that God exists than that he does not. If you insist on a secular view of the world and yet you continue to pronounce some things right and some things wrong, then I hope you see the deep disharmony between the world your intellect has devised and the real world and God that your heart knows exists. This leads us to a crucial question. If a premise, there is no God, leads to a conclusion you know isn't true, napalming babies is culturally relative, then why not change the premise? The endless, pointless litigation of existence. I've not tried to prove the existence of God to you. My goal has been to show you that you already know God is there. To some degree, I have been treating the non-existence of God as an intellectual problem, but it is much more than that. It not only makes all moral choices meaningless, but it makes all life meaningless too. The playwright Arthur Miller reveals this vividly through the character Quentin in After the Fall. Quentin says, "For many years I looked at life like a case at law. It was a series of proofs. When you're young, you prove how brave you are, or smart. Then, what a good lover. Then a good father. Finally, how wise or powerful or whatever. But underlying it all, you see now, there was a presumption that one moved on an upward path towards some elevation where, God knows what, I would be justified or even condemned. A verdict anyway. I think now that my disaster really began when I looked up one day and the bench was empty. No judge in sight, and all that remained was the endless argument with oneself. This pointless litigation of existence before an empty bench, which, of course, is another way of saying despair." Man, man, it's, I remember this when I was an atheist, just, why existence? It makes no sense. Like, why are we here? Oh man, yeah, I feel that for sure. I feel that for sure. I'm gonna just do this reaction.
Well said.
Yeah, if there's no one on the bench, then why are we trying to show ourselves to be good? And people are like, well, you can be good within yourself, and that's all that should be good. That's all that you should need. And it's like, okay, all right, yeah. I wish it worked like that, but it doesn't. Like the question is still why, and it's a rough question to answer for atheists, but for Christians, it's easy. You do have a moral incentive. You do have moral obligation. You want to be a good father, not only because for the benefit of your children and for the benefit of yourself and the society around you, but also because it pleases the Father. It pleases God. God looks at that and says, well done, and that matters. That means something. Being from the Navy, I was in the Navy and I was a enlisted guy, and you had to perform tasks and complete commands and things of that nature. And I remember doing a sample in the primary system, which is just taking radioactive coolant out of a system and analyzing it. And I was being observed doing it by the captain. And after the process, I did the procedure. I grabbed the sample and analyzed it and vocalized everything I was doing, explaining what I was doing. And the captain at the end of it was like, Pastor Williams, job well done. And that meant a lot to me. That means a lot to people when a superior recognizes that you have done a good job. That provides incentive, and that doesn't make you a bad person. It doesn't make you a bad person to appreciate that, So, yeah. Anyway, Keller continues. What is he saying? We all live as if it is better to seek peace instead of war, to tell the truth instead of lying, to care and nurture rather than to destroy. We believe that these choices are not pointless, that it matters which way we choose to live. Yet, if the cosmic bench is truly empty, then who says that one choice is better than the others? We can argue about it, but it's just pointless arguing, endless litigation. If the bench is truly empty, then the whole... No, excuse me, gotta click on this. Then the whole span of human civilization, even if it lasts a few million years, will be just an infinitesimally brief spark in relation to the oceans of dead time that preceded it and will follow it. There will be no one around to remember any of it. Whether we are loving or cruel in the end would make no difference at all. Once we realize the situation, there are two options. One is that we can simply refuse to think out to the implications of all this. We can hold on to our intellectual belief in an empty bench and yet live as if our choices are meaningful and as if there is a difference between love and cruelty. Why would we do that? A cynic may say that this is a way of having one's cake and eating it too. That is, you get the benefit of having a God without the cost of following him, but there is no integrity in that. The other option is to recognize that you do know there is a God. You could accept the fact that you live as if beauty and love have meaning, as if there is meaning in life, as if human beings have inherent dignity, all because you know God exists. It is dishonest to live as if he is there and yet fail to acknowledge the one who has given you all these gifts. And with that, we've reached the end of the chapter. So you know what that means. That means that we get to celebrate. Yeah! Woohoo! I feel like my voice is kind of giving out, but yahoo! We made it. We made it to the end of the chapter. I like this chapter. I think that it was good. I think that it was helpful and useful. I hope that you enjoyed the chapter as well, and that you get a sense of God's existence from these moral features of the world, that you can feel God's presence, when you do good things. You can feel the blessing of God, when you go out of your way to help someone in distress, that blessing that you receive, or the condemnation that you feel when you do something you know is wrong, that moral condemnation that distress that you feel, where it feels like your skin's prickling, or you're getting hot flashes, or that you feel extremely anxious and skittish. There's a reason for all this, There's a reason why we believe that humans have dignity, and not just our close of kin, not just the people that are gonna, propagate our DNA and help us propagate our DNA. There's a reason why we have beliefs in structure and meaning and beauty and things of that nature. It's such an important concept, like why is it that we reject it? More and more I'm confused by why people end up rejecting the existence of God. It makes no sense, why do it? There are no good reasons to reject the existence of God, and remember, it's all about worldview comparison. It's all about worldview analysis. If you're rejecting Christianity, if you're rejecting God, the existence of God, or at least doubting it, then you have to substitute Christianity, a worldview, with an alternative worldview. And you're going to hold a worldview whether you believe it or not. You definitely have assumptions, and you definitely make judgments and reason, and your reasoning follows it, whether you like it or not. And so you need to analyze that worldview and ask the question, why should I prefer the worldview that I hold rather than a competing one? Why should I prefer naturalism over Christianity? And naturalism doesn't have anything going for it. I have other videos explaining that it's more complicated than Christianity. It doesn't provide, there's no evidence that favors naturalism over Christianity. That doesn't have any evidence whatsoever that favors it over Christianity. So if you're all about evidence, then none of the evidence should lend you to believing in naturalism. And since naturalism is more complicated than Christianity, then Occam's razor kind of just gets rid of it. Not to mention all the pragmatic justifications, But we're going through that in more detail on Tuesdays in Christian Apologetics, the book that I'm reading that's written by Dr. Groheis. He gives explanation on what a worldview is, how to undergo doing worldview analysis, and tomorrow, the video that's coming out is going to be talking about pragmatic justifications, Pascal's wager. Definitely look into that. But next week, we're going to be looking into the problem of sin, chapter 10, on the reason for God. I hope that this book has been a blessing to you, and that you continue to seek God with your whole heart and your whole mind and with all your strength, and that you resist sin, and may God move mighty in your life. Make sure that you're watching these videos with an open mind and with an open heart, okay? And also drink water. All right. Have a great time. See you next week. All right. God bless. Bye-bye.
Hey, before you go, I hope you enjoyed today's enlightening discussion during our Christian Apologetics book study. It's always a blessing to come together to explore our faith and grow in our understanding. Your participation means the world to me, and I'm grateful for your continued support of Northeast Christian Apologetics. Remember, you can stay connected with me and access valuable resources by visiting my website at nechristianapologetics.com. There you'll find a wealth of articles, videos, and recommended reading material to deepen your knowledge of Christian apologetics. If you're as passionate as I am about equipping believers to defend their faith and engage in meaningful conversations, you can also support this ministry in various ways. One way to support this work is through patreon.com. By becoming a patron, you'll have access to exclusive content, early access to our discussions, and a chance to connect with like-minded individuals who share your passion for Christian apologetics. If Patreon is not your style, some people prefer to give me a one-time tip. And if you'd like to do that, then feel free to do so through Venmo or Cash App. But of course, there are many ways to support me. By praying for this ministry, sharing the content on social media, or simply spreading the word about what I do. Every bit of support goes a long way in helping me fulfill my mission. Once again, thank you for joining me today. Your presence and engagement enrich these discussions, and together, we're on a journey to strengthen our faith and share the good news with others. Stay tuned for more exciting book studies, thought-provoking discussions, and opportunities to grow your Christian apologetics journey. I look forward to seeing you again.